So today we're going to be talking about how to support a healthy immune system, what a healthy eating pattern looks like, and we'll talk about the role of supplements in immune system support. So, how do we support a healthy immune system? We know that the immune system is just that, it's a system, it's very complicated, it has a lot of moving parts. And for an optimal immune system, we really want a balance and a harmony between all of those different parts. So there's not one magic thing or silver bullet that you can do that will guarantee a boosted immune system, but there are some general guidelines that can help make sure that your immune system functions at its best. So the first line of defense is a healthy lifestyle. And that includes things like a healthy eating pattern, regular exercise or physical activity, stress management and social support, sleep, not smoking, and if you consume alcohol, consuming a moderate amount or not consuming any alcohol at all. And then hygiene, which we're all very aware of now, and practicing good food safety. So today we're going to be talking about a healthy eating pattern. So what does a healthy eating pattern look like? So some of you might be familiar with the healthy eating plate. This plate is specifically designed to help us eat in a way that promotes health and prevents disease. And this model gives you a general idea of what we want to have on our plate at each meal, and also what portions of those foods we need to eat to provide our bodies with the nutrients that it needs to be healthy so that we can support our immune system function. So the goal is that we fill half our plate with non-starchy vegetables, so typically 1 to 2 cups, and occasionally some fruit is fine, but mostly vegetables. A quarter of the plate filled with whole grains. This would also be where we could put our starchy vegetables, so those are things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, beans, corn, and green peas are all starchy vegetables, so they would go in your whole grain quarter rather than your vegetable half. And then the last quarter of your plate is lean protein. So we also have water on the side for hydration, or other unsweetened beverages for fluids, a tablespoon of fat to represent healthy fats. So in this case, they're using oil, but there are other healthy fats that we'll talk about more later in this presentation. And then, of course, exercise. So what you'll notice about this plate is we don't necessarily talk about specific numbers or grams for nutrients with this approach to eating. We will talk about specifics later on for some nutrients, but by following these portions and by using the plate as a model, you will generally be able to meet your nutrient needs without having to count or track anything. So, for example, filling half your plate at each meal with non-starchy vegetables will typically get you right around that recommended 3 to 5 cups per day. And a quarter of a plate of grains, a quarter of a plate of lean protein will typically help you meet those needs. Most of us actually over-consume grains and protein per day, so most of us are eating more than we need currently. The other thing about this plate that I love is that this approach to eating will help us meet nutrition targets that are often under-consumed, so things we usually don't get enough of. For example, fiber, omega-3 fatty acids, and essential vitamins and minerals. So what are some things that we should limit in a healthy eating pattern? There are certain nutrients and certain foods that we know that we should consume less of. And we're very intentional here in using the word limit rather than cut out or avoid, because all foods can fit in a healthy diet. So there's really no need to label anything as off limits. But we do know that there are some things that we should consume less of in order to support a healthy body and a healthy immune system. So the first nutrient of concern is sodium. And sodium is a nutrient of concern for us because it can potentially raise blood pressure in those of us who are salt sensitive. Unfortunately, there's no way to know if you are salt sensitive. There's no test for it. So the best rule of thumb is to just assume that you are. The other thing with sodium is that foods that are high in sodium also tend to be highly processed, and they are often high in other nutrients of concern as well. So things like saturated fat and added sugar. So the thing with sodium is that most of the sodium in our diet doesn't come from the salt shaker. So it's not salt that we're adding when we're cooking or when we are at the dinner table. Most of the sodium in our diet really comes from processed foods, packaged foods. It's coming from the sodium that manufacturers add to the food before we ever bring it home. So some of the highest or most commonly consumed high sodium foods are things like cold cuts, lunch meat, canned vegetables, if they're not low sodium or no salt added. If you can find those versions of canned vegetables, those are great options, but just regular canned vegetables or canned beans are typically very high in sodium. Same thing for canned soups. We have condiments represented on this slide. Bread and other baked goods like crackers and chips and wraps are typically very high in sodium. Fast food, of course, and things like pizza. So the sodium recommendation is under 2,300 milligrams per day if you currently do not have high blood pressure, and under 1,500 milligrams per day if you do have high blood pressure. It's generally a good idea for all of us to consume less sodium. So the lower we can get our sodium intake, the better. And that's because even if you don't have high blood pressure now, studies have shown that if you consume high levels of sodium for a long period of time, that can lead to high blood pressure or heart problems later in life. So what are some ways to add flavor without adding salt? So you can use herbs and spices to add lots of different flavors. Vinegars and other acids like lemon juice, lime juice, and other citruses. Those are excellent ways to add flavor, and they actually mimic the flavor of salt on our taste buds. So they sort of trigger the same taste receptors that salt does. So that's an easy way to make things taste salty without actually adding salt. And it's important to keep in mind that as you start to decrease your sodium intake, in the beginning, things might taste a little bit blander than usual, but your taste buds do have about a 3-week lifespan. So once more of your taste buds start to turn over, they will get used to the decreased amount of salt that you're having, and things will start to taste less bland as you are patient and continue to kind of decrease your sodium intake over time. So the next nutrient of concern that we want to limit in our diet is saturated fat. So saturated fat, we know, can raise your total blood cholesterol levels and your LDL cholesterol levels. And both of those things, when they're higher, that increases your risk for cardiovascular disease, things like stroke, heart attack, etc. So the recommendation from the Dietary Guidelines for Americans, which is released by the federal government every 5 years, that recommends limiting your saturated fat intake to less than 10% of your daily calories. And that recommendation is based on evidence that when we replace saturated fat with unsaturated fat, we see an associated reduction in risk of heart disease. So less than 10% of your daily calories. So for example, if you consume 2,000 calories per day, 10% of that is 200 calories. And then we would divide by 9 because there are 9 calories in each gram of fat. So 200 calories divided by 9 gets us about 22 grams of saturated fat per day maximum. And it's important to note that 2,000 calories per day is not right for everybody. Many of us need less than that, so your saturated fat needs would be even lower. I also want to point out that the American Heart Association has its own recommendations for saturated fat, which is less than 5 to 6% of your daily calories, so even more stringent. So using that same 2,000 calorie diet, 5 to 6% is basically half, or about 11 grams per day of saturated fat. So the main sources of saturated fat are animal products like meat and full-fat dairy, high-fat processed foods like fast food, fried foods, pastries, desserts, and tropical oils like coconut and palm oil. So it's really important to point out that coconut oil, despite all of the health claims out there that you might have heard, is not a heart-healthy fat. It is about 90% saturated fat. It actually contains more saturated fat per volume than butter, and it will increase your risk of heart disease, just like other foods that are high in saturated fat. So what are some ways to reduce our intake and maybe replace saturated fats with healthier fats? So on the left, we have just another list of kind of commonly eaten saturated fats. We have red meat, includes pork and beef, skin on the poultry, so that's where most of the fat lives. It's not really in the meat itself. Lunch meats, especially things like salami, bologna, certainly ham and roast beef also contain saturated fat. Processed meats like sausage, bacon, hot dogs, full-fat dairy, so that's whole milk or 2% milk, are both considered high in saturated fat. So if you're choosing a milk, we would prefer a skim or a 1% to be lower in fat. Full-fat dairy also includes whole milk yogurt and other dairy products like cheese. Butter and mayonnaise, of course, are very high in saturated fat. And then baked goods that are made with butter or made with coconut oil. And fried foods, even if they're fried in a vegetable oil, which is not high in saturated fat, the fried foods themselves still tend to contain quite a bit of saturated fat. So then on the right, we have some healthy alternatives. So not listed here is poultry without the skin, but that could certainly be a lean protein choice. Then we have fatty fish like salmon, trout, tuna, sardines, mackerel, flaxseed, either ground or flaxseed oil, nuts and nut butters. And no one nut is better than the other. They're all about the same. You really just want to, buy the ones that you enjoy, that you're most likely to eat. And then if you can work in some variety, choosing different nuts throughout the week, that's also a good rule of thumb. Seeds, so things like pumpkin seeds, sunflower seeds, chia seeds, sesame seeds, vegetable oils, and again, they're all about the same. Generally speaking, canola oil tends to be a little bit higher in omega-3 compared to just plain vegetable oil, but olive oil is also very popular. There's avocado oil now that's pretty available. So really just whatever you enjoy and can find. Avocado and olives. So if you notice that your current diet contains a lot of the foods on the left, you can gradually transition to healthier fats by making smart substitutions when you're cooking. So if currently you're cooking with butter all the time, maybe try replacing half of that butter with oil the next time you cook, or just try to use less butter, maybe getting a non-stick pan. That way you don't need as much butter to prevent things from sticking. For things like sandwiches or salads, I always like to recommend using avocado instead of cheese or mayonnaise, and then choosing lean proteins instead of red meat. So having red meat less often, having things like chicken and fish, or plant-based proteins like nuts and seeds and soy products. So we want to limit sodium, we want to limit saturated fat. Those will both decrease our risk for chronic diseases. Added sugar is another nutrient that we want to keep an eye out for. So added sugar is a concern because a lot of our extra calories come from added sugar, and that tends to increase our risk of obesity, which then increases our risk for many other chronic diseases. So the difference between added sugar and natural sugar is that some sugars are naturally occurring in a food. So fruits are a great example of this. Lactose is another natural sugar. So just plain yogurt with nothing added, no sweeteners, no fruits or anything. Even plain yogurt has natural sugar because it contains lactose, which is a sugar that occurs in milk products. And then there's added sugar. So added sugar is just that. It's sugar that's added by the manufacturer. It could be cane sugar, it could be honey, it could be maple syrup, it could be agave. Doesn't really matter what form it's in. What's important is that it wasn't naturally occurring in the food. It was added after the fact. So this information is not always readily available on food labels. It's not required yet that manufacturers list out the added sugars separately, but some manufacturers are already voluntarily doing this, so that makes it much easier to decide if a food will help you stay under that recommendation or not. But right now, a lot of foods just say total sugars or just sugars, so you'll want to check the ingredients label. So if you see anything in the ingredients label that says sugar or anything that ends in OSE, like dextrose or maltose or fructose, any syrups, those are good clues that it's got added sugar. It doesn't necessarily tell you how much, but at least you know that it does contain added sugar that way. So the recommendation is less than 10% of your daily calories coming from added sugar. So just like saturated fat, if you're consuming 2,000 calories a day, that's less than, you'd want 200 calories or less coming from added sugar. And if we divide 200 by 4, since there are 4 calories per gram of sugar, we get 50 grams of added sugar per day maximum. And again, if you only need 1,500 or 1,700 calories per day, then your recommendation for added sugar is less than that. Women typically, the goal is typically closer to 25 grams per day versus men might be closer to 50. So to put things in perspective, one 20-ounce bottle of Mountain Dew contains 75 grams of added sugar. So for someone who is trying to keep their sugar intake under 25 grams per day, that is 3 times your recommended amount in one bottle for the entire day. It's certainly more sugar than anybody needs in one day and certainly one sitting. So aside from soda, which is definitely a huge source of added sugar, some of these other sources might be surprising. So things like granola bars and granola, there's a big range of how much sugar is added to these products, but for the most part, I would say that many of them nutritionally are closer to dessert. They're more like cookies than like a healthy snack or a healthy breakfast. So that's something to watch out for. Same thing for cereal. There's a huge range of sugar content of cereals nowadays. There are plenty of cereals that are low in sugar, that are high in fiber, that are minimally processed that I would, feel good about recommending. And then there's sugars that are, again, much closer to like a dessert as far as the sugar content. So just being aware of how much sugar is in your favorite cereal. Same thing for oatmeal and yogurt. Plain oatmeal and plain yogurt are naturally very low in sugar. Yogurt does contain some, but it's much lower than what you'll find in a flavored variety potentially. Same thing for oatmeal. So the plain oatmeal is a much better choice. Even if you add sugar to it yourself, you're gonna usually add a lot less than a pre-seasoned oatmeal. And you don't have to cook it on the stove. They do make instant plain oatmeal. So if that's something you're concerned about, that is definitely still available. And then things like condiments and sauces, salad dressings, anything based in tomatoes, so salsa, tomato sauce, tomato soup, those often have a lot more sugar added to them than people might expect. And that's to balance out the acidity of the tomatoes. It's just something the food manufacturer does to try to make their product taste better. So just to be aware of that. Breads and baked goods, like desserts, obviously. Breads sometimes have added sugar. Usually it's not going to be a huge contributor depending on how much bread you eat, but it is something to be aware of. So all of these foods that we've looked at so far, as far as the ones that are high in sodium, saturated fat, and added sugar, you might have noticed that all of them tend to be processed. So, what is a processed food? Basically, a processed food is something that has had something done to it as far as, flavorings that have been added, or maybe it's been pre-cooked already in some way. Typically, it comes in a package or a wrapper or something like that, or maybe it's a frozen meal or something like that. So those foods, again, tend to be very high in those nutrients that we're trying to reduce our intake of. And to reduce our intake of those things like sodium and saturated fat and added sugar, we want to focus more on whole foods. So whole foods are things that appear very close to how they grow in nature. So these things typically, and they might still come in a package, but they typically have very few ingredients. So typically 3 ingredients or less is a good rule of thumb. So an example would be plain oats, typically just 1 ingredient, just oats, versus like a oat and honey granola bar, which sounds very whole foody, right? It's got oats, it's got honey, it sounds very healthy. But if you look at the ingredients label on the wrapper of the bar or on the box, typically you'll see much more than 3 ingredients. Typically it's like 5 to 10 ingredients, depending on the bar. So that's just an example. There are other examples too, like, fresh or frozen, just plain meat, like a plain chicken breast or plain piece of beef, versus a frozen breaded chicken patty, or lunch meat or corned beef, right? Any of the meats that have already been cured, like bacon, or pastrami, or seasoned or cooked, like lunch meats, those are all going to be really processed foods. So whole foods are really the thing that we're emphasizing with the plate model. And they're super, super important because they are the best source of micronutrients. So there's this phenomenon called micronutrient malnutrition, which is where a person can be eating enough calories to sustain their weight. So they're not starving by any means, but they're still deficient in those essential vitamins and minerals. So they're not, even though they're getting enough food, they're not getting enough nutrition. So essential vitamins and minerals are things that we can only get from our diet. There are some things that we can make in our bodies that we can synthesize, and then there are some things that we can't, that we absolutely need and we can only get from food. So whole foods are going to be your best source of those essential vitamins and minerals and fatty acids. So it's important that we incorporate a lot of those in our diet. The other thing that whole foods are an excellent source of is antioxidants and phytochemicals. So antioxidants are compounds that help reduce inflammation. They fight free radicals and other oxidative stress, and they're important to immune system function. Phytochemicals often have similar functions or maybe slightly different functions, but the key is that phytochemicals typically all come from plants. So the other thing I wanted to point out in this presentation is just a couple of key nutrients related to immune system function. And again, I want to emphasize that there's no one magical nutrient or magical vitamin that will, boost your immune system. But we want to make sure we're getting a balanced and complete diet in order to support a healthy system overall. So there are other nutrients not listed on the slide that are still important for health and for immune function. These are just some key ones that I wanted to highlight. So the first one is beta carotene, or vitamin A. And beta carotene is a very powerful antioxidant that helps reduce inflammation. It can also increase our disease-fighting cells or infection-fighting cells in our body. So good food sources of beta carotene include orange vegetables like sweet potatoes, carrots, pumpkin, and other winter squash like butternut squash, and dark leafy greens. So things like broccoli, kale, spinach, etc. And then we have vitamin C and E. So these are antioxidants that help us destroy free radicals in our body and support our natural immune response. So sources of vitamin C include red peppers, oranges, strawberries, broccoli, mangoes, lemons, and lots of other fruits and vegetables. Vitamin E typically comes from nuts and seeds, vegetable oils, spinach, and broccoli. And then we have vitamin D. So research has shown that vitamin D supplementation could reduce our risk of infections, including viral infections and respiratory tract infections. And it does that by reducing the production of pro-inflammatory compounds, so things that tend to increase inflammation in our bodies. Higher levels of vitamin D in the blood have also been linked to the prevention of other chronic diseases, including tuberculosis, hepatitis, and heart disease. So good food sources of vitamin D include things like fatty fish and mushrooms if they have been irradiated. Fortified foods, so these are foods that have had vitamin D added to them. Things like cereals and plant-based milks often have been fortified with vitamin D. And then dairy is also a natural source. And then the last nutrient is zinc. So the other four on this slide are vitamins. Zinc is a mineral. It's been shown to help boost our white blood cell protection or production, which will help protect us against infection and other invaders like bacteria and viruses. And good sources include oysters, other shellfish, chicken, beef, and pork also contain smaller amounts of zinc. Beans, nuts, seeds, lentils, and whole grains are other good sources. So with these nutrients, it's really important to mention that we have research that shows that when we don't get enough of these nutrients, when we're deficient, that we see a negative effect on our immune system as a result of those deficiencies. But we don't yet have any evidence to suggest, or we don't have enough evidence to suggest that over supplementation or over intake of these is beneficial. So the goal here is really just getting enough rather than getting more than we need or getting extra through supplementation. So you might notice that there's a lot of different colors of fruits and vegetables represented on this slide. And that's just another way to illustrate the importance of getting variety in our diet. So you might have heard the term eating a rainbow. So eating fruits and vegetables from every color of the rainbow. We also want to vary the types of foods that we're eating in other categories. So getting protein, not just from chicken all the time or not just from beef all the time, bringing in fish, bringing in nuts and seeds and beans as well. That promotes a balanced and complete diet so that we're getting, all of the vitamins and minerals that we need to support good health. And I should also note here that variety doesn't have to be on a daily basis. So you don't have to try to eat a rainbow every single day, although it's not as hard as it sounds. But, we just don't want to eat the same 3 fruits and vegetables day after day, week after week. You want to switch it up, maybe if you have apples and bananas one day, maybe the next day have some berries, have some mango or something. Same thing with vegetables. We don't want to be eating the same 3 vegetables over and over. We want to be eating seasonally and switching up the variety there so we're getting lots of different nutrients. All right, so what about supplements? Maybe someone is wondering if they could just take a multivitamin that would provide them with enough of all of these vitamins and minerals, and then they don't have to worry about their diet. So really the goal is always, whenever possible, to get your nutrients from food first rather than through supplements. And the reason is that nutrients don't work in isolation, or rather they don't work in a vacuum. In nature, they don't exist in isolation. So basically what we found is that when we take nutrients as a supplement, when they're isolated in a pill, they don't work as well as when we get them through food. And there's a lot of different theories about why that is. But basically, it's because there are lots of other compounds in foods, like phytochemicals and other things that we really just don't understand yet. We don't really understand how they potentially interact and why the nutrients are more effective in food. but that's what we found so far. So definitely want to get nutrients from food first. If you're deficient in a certain nutrient, like you don't get enough vitamin D, or if you're a vegan and you don't get enough vitamin B12, that might be where a supplement or a daily multivitamin could be beneficial for closing any gaps. But remember that more is not better. So if your diet is already adequate, if you're already eating a balanced diet, you're not necessarily going to get any extra benefit from taking a multivitamin and getting like extra. Typically we don't see any benefits there. And if you do choose to take a multivitamin or a supplement, make sure that you are buying something with that USP seal that I put in the top right corner. That is going to tell you that that supplement has been verified. So someone has checked it for quality and that you're getting what the label says you're getting. That's really important. So then there's also a different category of supplements. So we have herbal and natural supplements. A lot of them have different claims. Many of them claim to boost immune function. And we want to be aware that although some of these supplements have been found to potentially affect certain aspects of your immune system, right now we don't have enough evidence that they will actually increase your immune system function to the point where you are better protected from disease or infection compared to when you weren't taking the supplement. So there's a lot of reasons for that. One of them is, again, because immune function is so complicated, maybe a lab can prove that a supplement increases your antibody levels, for example, but it's much harder to prove that those increased antibodies then help increase your protection from infection. That's a lot harder to prove. So we just don't have enough evidence yet to support the intake of these supplements. And then it's also important to remember that they're not regulated by the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, unlike those multivitamins and other supplements, like vitamin and mineral supplements that are regulated. Herbal and natural supplements that are not regulated means that no one is checking the claims to make sure that they're valid and based on evidence. No one is checking the quality, and no one is checking to make sure that you are getting what the label actually says you're getting. A lot of times with these supplements, it's not uncommon where what's actually in the supplement is different than what's being advertised. So that's important to remember. And then we also want to remember that along the lines of more is not better for vitamins and minerals, that toxicity is actually possible for many of these. So there are some vitamins and some minerals where if we consume too much, there are actually potentially negative or toxic side effects. And we only really see that with supplementation. It's extremely difficult to get too much, to reach toxicity levels through diet alone. When we see toxicity, it's almost always due to over supplementation. So just be careful with how much you're taking. All right, so in summary, remember that the healthy eating plate is specifically designed to help us eat in a way that promotes health, prevents disease, both chronic and infectious, and supports immune system function. By aiming to make most of our meals look like the plate and varying the colors of fruits and vegetables and types of foods that we're eating, we'll be eating in a way that helps support a healthy immune system and is a key part of that overall